Welcome to the Better Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. What happens when a liberal and a conservative decide to jump in an old Volvo and drive across the country? That's the question at the heart of today's podcast. Jordan Blashek is a businessman, a conservative, and a former Marine from the San Fernando Valley in California. Christopher Haugh is a journalist, a writer, and a lawyer from Berkeley. Jordan and Chris met at law school, and they quickly found out they wanted to be friends. But they couldn't stop arguing about politics, and their conversations often led to friction. In early 2016, they decided to take a cross-country road trip to explore America and to try to understand new perspectives. In 2017, they decided to do it again, and again, and again. Now they've decided to write a book about their experiences. Union, a Democrat, a Republican, and a search for common ground. Union is the story of their friendship, and how that friendship changed the way they see themselves. It's the story of who they met along the way. And ultimately, it's the story of two homies finding their better angels through trial, error, and travel. John and I really enjoyed this conversation. I think we see a lot of ourselves in their story. We hope you do too.
You gentlemen are here because you guys have had a unique experience, a unique series of experiences, unique journey together. And that journey is now producing a book, which I think our listeners will be very interested in hearing about and knowing about, maybe picking up when it comes off the shelves. But before we get there, tell us a little bit about who you guys are individually, how you guys met, and just where this odyssey began. Who wants to start us off here?
Yeah, I'll kick us off.
Okay. And let folks know who's talking.
All right, this is Jordan. So I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, just like John, and grew up nice Jewish boy. Went off to college, and while I was in college, became inspired by a lot of the vets who were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. So I joined the Marine Corps after college. I served 5 years as an infantry officer, and then got out in 2014, decided to go to law school. Didn't really know what I wanted to do, so it seemed like a good holding pattern. And while I was there, I met Chris.
Oh,
nice.
Nice. Yeah. And
Enter Chris.
Sure,
Okay.
that's me. I'm Chris. Yeah, so I grew up in California as well, but Northern California in Berkeley. I grew up wanting to be a writer. And so when I went to college, the first thing I did, I went to Berkeley, go Bears. Mm-hmm. And first thing I did was go to the Daily Californian and sign up to be a sports writer. And from there, just, continued to write as a journalist. Also interested in politics the whole time. And I always wanted to sort of fuse those two passions as much as I could. Through a series of fortunate and unfortunate events, I ended up in Washington, D.C. and becoming a speechwriter. And I worked for a couple years in the Obama administration as a speechwriter. Nice. At the State Department. And then I ended up going to law school actually as a pivot. I imagined it as a pivot back into journalism, which I get a lot of puzzled looks when I say that. But there's kind of a well-worn path of that at where we went at Yale Law School. And that's where I met Jordan.
By the way, for folks listening, if you guys were listening here in studio with us, and I told you one of these gentlemen is a former Marine, the other fellow is from Berkeley, you wouldn't have too tough a time figuring out who was who. But anyway, please continue.
Yeah, that's part of our thing. Yeah, the long hair and
that's our shtick.
Yeah.
With me and John, it's kind of the opposite. We did an event in Berkeley, and so John ran for Congress as a Republican against Maxine Waters, and so we go to Berkeley, and I worked for the Obama campaign and the Clinton campaign. So we get there, and immediately someone comes up to John and was like, "I'm so sorry about the loss in 2016." He's like, "No, I'm the other guy."
Yeah, that doesn't happen to us. That doesn't happen to us.
Right.
Oh, that's funny. Well, so that's where our story starts. Is we met at law school. I'm a Republican. Chris is a Democrat. And that first year, we became fast friends. And as the year went on, 2016 election approaches, and we found that these great conversations we used to have were now always focusing on politics. And those evenings ended in, having us red in the face and storming off away from each other. And it was around kind of May 2016 that I had to be in LA. My sister was getting married. and I decided I wanted to drive. And so one night, as people around us were kind of shouting about politics, I hit Chris on the chest and said, "Hey man, do you want to take a drive with me?" And that's what kicked it off. And from there, we hit the road, and you just find that on the road in America, you just see the country differently. You get away from all the noise, and you find that it's beautiful, and the people you meet are hospitable, and there's something special out there. And so we just kind of made it a priority in our life to get back on the road. And after our third road trip, we decided that there's a story here, and people need to hear it. That there is more going on outside kind of the spotlight of politics than we're hearing about.
So was it 3 cross-country trips, or how did you break up this odyssey, as John said?
Yeah, we've been on, I think we were counting it up earlier today. We've been on 7. We went to 44 states and read around 20,000 miles. So, and we left and went on various kind of road trips. So I think we've been across the country once on the northern route, and then we've been across the country through like sort of other meandering ways at least 3 other times, and then the rest are sort of tour the Southwest or leave California and check out Nevada, and we did one across northern Mexico. So we're just kind of all over the place and trying to see as much as possible.
And did you initially, as you were first getting on the tour, think that you were going to be documenting the experiences? I know you said you're a writer, and I presume you like to journal and write, but when did it sort of become, I think there's something here that we might want to shape into a larger product that can tell our story and inspire people?
So I think after the first road trip, kind of like everyone who goes on the road, we had these visions of like, hey, we should do a documentary. Mm-hmm. And we started playing around with that for a little while, just for fun. And then one day realized like, wait, we actually don't know anything about that. Right. And so it was really the third trip that we decided we wanted to start writing about it. And Chris, naturally, as a journalist, just always is kind of taking notes on his phone. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of helped us get started.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's dig a little bit into the meat of some of the experiences that you guys had. And by the way, so the time frame we're talking about, so you guys said that you took 7 trips in total?
Thereabouts, yeah.
Yeah, 7 trips. First one was May 2016, and the last one was
April. Yeah, last April.
So 8 months ago.
So the first one was before the 2016 election. Was there another one or two between the first one and the election itself?
Nope, that was the first one, and the next one was about a year later.
So let's start with that one, because all of the other ones come after whether you were happy with the outcome or not, the most unanticipated, I think,
yes, absolutely,
presidential election probably ever, right? But even in March of 2016, we were already, I think, I think Americans felt like we were already in the twilight zone in many respects, just in terms of how the conversation was changing and what we were seeing in the national race. So take us into sort of where you went again on that first tour, what you learned from that first journey, and maybe what some of the highlights were in terms of conversations or experiences you had with folks across the spectrum in the context of the election. What was all that like in March of what was America like from your vantage point in March of 2016?
Yeah, I think the key on that first trip is as you're out on the road and you're hearing news stories of protesters shutting down freeways in San Diego, or Trump rallies with like tinges of violence, over in somewhere down in the South. Mm-hmm. On the road, you don't hear any of it, and life kind of slows down a little bit. Mm-hmm. And most of our experiences were just us, and we were having great conversations on the road and seeing the national parks. But it all kind of came together around this one experience we had with an Idaho state trooper who pulled us over. And this experience kind of kicked off the book for us. And what happened was Chris was driving. Chris is actually normally the slow driver. He's very cautious.
Good driver, cautious driver.
Yeah, I have the lead foot. Sure. But Chris was driving. He was going about 90, and we get pulled over by the state trooper. And Chris gets a little tense. I think for me as a former Marine, I have a lot of experience with law enforcement. They're kind of like my people. And for Chris, it's not.
Jordan's being kind. I was shaking like a leaf and sweating. I had a Berkeley Political Review shirt on. My hair was like below, down to my shoulders. My earrings felt like they were shinier than ever. I was freaking out.
Basically a big target sign.
That's what it felt like. Yeah. That's what it felt like.
Yeah. So the trooper pulls us over and asks for our driver's licenses. He sees that mine's from California. Chris is from DC. My car has New York plates. It was my grandparents' car. They can't drive anymore, so they gave it to me. And he asked us, like, what are you guys doing? We said, we're driving across the country. Jordan's going to school in California. Chris in Connecticut. And he just seemed so confused by the story. And none of it made sense. He's like, I don't understand. Why would you be switching states like that? I don't understand why you both are together. And nothing made sense to him. So he ended up pulling Chris out of the car, putting him into his truck and interrogating him for about 40 minutes, convinced that we were probably trafficking drugs or something. And what came out of that is he kept saying, none of this makes any sense. None of this makes any sense. And that kind of took on deeper meaning for us, where it was this question of well, if Idahoan can't understand two people from California, what's going on in the country that we don't really recognize each other anymore? Yeah. And that question kind of set us off on the road.
Well, and it went both ways too. I mean, I didn't understand why the heck we didn't make sense. I mean, this was something that, my mother had done many times, driven across the country and through states that, she had no business being in. And this was just something that you do. So the simple fact of, we're out here on a cross-country road trip, the fact that we got silence and blinking and potential accusations of drug running was absolutely otherworldly to me. So there was just something lost in translation there.
It was almost as if you were being accosted for having stepped into a foreign country.
Yeah, it felt like that.
Idaho and New York and DC and California we're all a part of the same nation, right?
Right.
Last time I looked at the map, anyway.
Yeah.
So that is a striking statement.
Yeah, and then following right after that, what ended up happening is after interrogating Chris, he comes over, talks to me. I tell him, I'm a former Marine. I would never do drugs, and immediately his demeanor changed. He shakes my hand, and then ultimately lets us go. And in the car, Chris is kind of shocked that it turns out this guy was really nice, and he shook our hands and wished us well. Didn't get a ticket, which was great, and. My first statement was, cops are nice. If you treat them with respect, generally things are fine. And this set off kind of an explosive fight we had right afterwards about well, is that true? Or is it only true for certain kind of people? And, this kind of was the story of these trips is we have experiences, we digest them, we fight about them, we wrestle with what it meant. And, from that first trip where a lot of those fights were explosive, by the end, the disagreement between us still there, but we just handled it much differently.
And how would you say that your approach to these conversations changed over the course of your time on the road as you kind of see what works, what doesn't work, what's constructive, what's destructive? How did you guys think about that, and what place have you come to?
I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? I going back to Idaho and our first couple of fights on the road, I mean, that was definitely about scoring points. I mean, neither of us were really there to understand or to exchange views. It was about I am right and this is why, and that's often why we ended up just kind of going quiet. Most of our fights just sort of petered out because we lost our energy. It didn't come to any sort of, well, I hear what you're saying, and this is what I'm saying, and okay, I understand. And one thing that we often say is that the beauty of these road trips is that you're in the car for hours on end, so you have no choice but to come back together and try again. So our process has been very much so trial and error. And by the, we chart this through the book, but we slowly started to get to a point where there was so much trust in our conversations, and that we started to actually want to understand. We started to actually exchange, and we started to actually understand where each other is coming from. That I had these initial interactions with police in my youth that were not so great. I also had, I grew up reading about the Black Panthers, being based in Oakland, and so I had a very different sort of first principle when it comes to police officers, and over time, those sorts of backgrounds, our different histories kind of came to the fore, and we're able to sort of say, okay, this is where you're coming from. What can I learn from that?
Totally. Well, I think, humans are naturally curious creatures, but we also have the fight or flight response. And I think that as politics has become more filled with rancor and animosity and suspicion and mistrust, the fight or flight sort of starts to create a haze over the curiosity. But if you can kind of peel back that layer of defensiveness, like, we really do want to hear from people who are different from us, especially when we find that we actually respect and like them, as sort of has happened with many of the people who participated in Better Angels workshops.
Yeah, there was a national, I think, sort of fight or flight response that was triggered and triggered is maybe the appropriate word, by the 2016 election. Almost literally. I mean, one, it set everybody to arguing with each other. Two, I think it probably pushed at least a few people to move to Canada or elsewhere, or at least to threaten to do so, right? And so
a lot of empty threats, I think.
Those threats are
like
usually,
Lena Dunham was like,
yeah,
I'm moving to Canada.
Yeah, right. Those threats are usually empty. Although I did hear a story about a man who, after the 2016 election, he lived on a farm somewhere or something like that. And he was already sort of removed, and he decided just not to listen to any information through the media or the news that came to him afterwards. And journalists caught up with him like a year or two later, and he had no idea anything that had happened in America under Trump's administration, because he was that petrified by it that he just decided, I don't want to know. And for all I know, this man still has no idea about,
happiest man in America.
maybe, but it signals something, I think. That is this epic sort of, conflagration / withdrawal that is taking place between the various sides of our social and political conversation. And so you guys picked up the tour project again after the 2016 election. So let me ask, did that have anything to do with it? I mean, was there sort of a conscious sense that, hey, we did this in March of 2016, but now clearly things are continuing to change in a very kind of unpredictable sort of way? Was there kind of a reappreciation of the importance of you guys doing this that was part of the inspiration for getting back on the road? Why did you guys decide to do this a second time?
Yeah, that was exactly it. We did that first trip. The country seemed to be heading, towards some big, reckoning, and then January 2017 happens, and all of a sudden we're in an environment that I don't think many people, at least that were in our lives, ever expected to see with a Trump presidency. And things only got worse from there. I remember those first few months. It felt like the whole country was convulsing, and both of us kept stewing on that question of this doesn't make any sense. And we decided that we wanted to spend some of our summer break. We were still in law school at that point. That we would spend some of our summer break back on the road. And Charlottesville broke out, which was a pretty traumatic episode for the country. And we hit the road about a week later. And so the environment was tense. And we thought that getting back on the road might give us some answers, that we'd be able to figure out what the hell was happening while we were out there.
And in retrospect, too, I mean, it also felt like we were out to justify the friendship. I mean, we had built this friendship in lieu of politics. Like politics was not big. I mean, Jordan mentioned this, but we talked books and career aspirations and where we were from initially, and then the election occurred, and then suddenly it felt like we weren't supposed to be friends anymore, and that didn't feel right. There's something wrong about that we couldn't be friends just simply because we vote differently or we registered for different parties. And so this road trip was our attempt to say, okay, can we bring back a reason for this? Can we bring back something?
And did you guys experience sort of any heat from your own bubbles of people saying like, why are you going on a road trip with this guy? I mean, like, yeah, I'm curious about that because John and I have in some ways kind of a similar experience, and it's been sort of interesting navigating that. So I'm curious, how did that manifest?
I see Jordan pointing at Chris.
Yeah, well,
poor Chris took the brunt of it.
Well, I don't think maybe Jordan's got different stories to tell, but it mainly was around the book, to be honest. The trips themselves, we kind of had people go, "What? You're driving across the country? Like that sounds kind of dope. I want to try that."
Yeah.
And so we had some interest, and in fact, we eventually took a friend along for one of them who speaks fluent Spanish, which was very helpful on the road to Juarez. But no. I mean, the book is really where people have said, "Really? You're writing a book with him about that?" But the other thing, the honest truth though, is that there's a there's a desire for this kind of thing out there. You know, when I say like I'm writing a book with Jordan, who's a Republican, about our friendship and about what we found to justify this friendship, to explain this friendship, people are like, oh, that's amazing. It's about time.
Totally.
So by the second tour, you guys had not yet decided to write a book.
No, yeah.
Right. So how did things so when you got back on the road, how did things feel different, or did they feel different? Following 2016 than they did prior to 2016. And granted, you guys were on a different route this time. So take us through, I guess, how the new journey starts to materialize. Where are you guys traveling through now, and what does the temperature of the country feel like? Going into the Trump presidency, and now in the new context of your continuing friendship.
Yeah, so we set off on that trip, and we began in the Bay Area, drove down the length of California, decided to go into Tijuana for a night. And coming out of Tijuana, we didn't really have any agenda. We thought we'd swing through the Southwest. And Chris looked at his phone and said, hey, Trump's speaking in Phoenix. What if we go there? I was a little nervous, just knowing kind of this was a week post Charlottesville. And we ultimately decided to go for it. And so we kind of went into the heart of this political maelstrom that was brewing.
I would have thought the Berkeley hippie would have been more nervous.
Well, I regretted it immediately after I said it.
Okay. Gotcha.
And so we go to the Trump rally, and the city is tense. There's large dump trucks lining the streets to kind of prevent vehicles from driving, up onto the sidewalks and hitting people.
The attack in Barcelona had just occurred as well, so everyone's very on edge.
Right, and there are riot police everywhere. Thousands and thousands of people. Twitter stories of bikers for Trump descending on the city, and then thousands of protesters marshaling on the other side. And we got to the city. It was August, so 110 degrees, and you could just feel the tension in the air. And we get there, and we show up around 6. Trump's set to go up on stage at 7, and we figure we're not getting in. There's no way. And just kind of using some initiative, we kind of pushed to the front of the line, ended up sneaking into the rally just to observe. And that was a pretty wild experience, like getting to see a Trump rally firsthand and what was going on inside. I think there were some surprising things to both of us in there. And then afterwards, we went outside to kind of mingle around with the protesters, and again, kind of surprised by some things in that experience. But ultimately, it all came to a crashing end when tear gas got launched off. One of the kind of Antifa-like protesters threw something at the cops, and from there it descended into chaos, and people running around, tear gas in their eyes, and what could have been an interesting experience of exchange and dialogue, which we saw fleeting moments of, ended up just kind of twinged with violence.
Had either of you ever been in a situation quite like that before? Of course, you're a Marine, Jordan, and I imagine you've been deployed and so forth, different type of situation and so forth. But would either of you say that you had comparable experiences that, prepared you for a turn like that, or did it all just kind of come completely out of left field in your imaginations?
I mean, it definitely came out of left field. So we went to the rally. We came outside in this area that we called the Brackish area, because all the protesters were sort of lined up, and then all the rally goers were coming out. And so, of course, there's this one area where they all kind of mix. And we were actually very impressed that we actually saw quite a bit of exchange and dialogue. It was like what we were hoping we would see. And there's this like beautiful sort of like 45-minute period where we saw, rally goers talking to Black Lives Matter protesters and talking about the state of the country, and we were really impressed. And then suddenly it was boom,
right? All of a sudden,
everyone
that's a nice metaphor for, I think, how I see so much of the national conversation. You do have, and of course at Better Angels we observe this, you do have people like yourselves, and folks who are hardened Trump supporters, and people who are Black Lives Matter supporters, and others who do want to take the initiative to have these conversations. But then somebody lobs a grenade or or something into the dialogue,
chaos,
and whether it's on social media or in physical reality, all hell breaks loose, and that becomes the headline. Of course, not the fact that some folks really did want an exchange.
That's exactly right. And I think there are two lessons we took out of that experience. One is that when the spotlights are on, people do perform, and they perform to type, and they act a little bit differently. under the spotlight than they do in the quieter moments. And so that was first. And then second is we've gotten really good at drawing battle lines, and the narratives that emerge out of these events or stories in the country are of two sides irreconcilably opposed. And we saw something different on the ground. We saw a lot of diversity among the people who were going to the rally or were outside protesting. And that diversity reflected in things like the Black Lives Matter protesters talking to the Trump supporters, who were very different from, some of the Antifa folks or some of the white supremacists who, were on the fringes.
And so that surprised you about the rally. Going in, what you saw didn't necessarily conform to expectations.
Exactly.
Not at all. There's this one group. So we were outside. It's Arizona. There were militiamen, sort of in I've learned to say full kit, which means that they got the whole uniform, guns, and everything. Exactly.
Yeah.
And we were like, wow, look at these militiamen. These libertarian,
crazy right wingers
types. And we eventually we chatted with one of them, and we're like, so Jordan's like, who are you guys? And we're like, oh, we're the John Brown Gun Club.
The John Brown Gun Club.
And we're like, come again? The John Brown Gun Club, and they're
like Harper's Ferry, John Brown.
They're named after the Harper's Ferry, John Brown.
And they're an anti-white supremacist militia who have some communist streak, I think, in their.
Whoa!
Put the red back in redneck.
Wow.
On their cards. Yeah,
and so we saw all that.
We could spend a minute on that.
Yeah, exactly. It was pretty wild, and it was those kind of surprises that I think really. Told us that there's something deeper going on here that we want to explore, and we just need to get away from these battle lines. And those battle lines, force people to pick sides. Like every time someone asks me, do you support Trump or not? They've drawn a battle line that forces me to say yes or no, but it ignores all the nuance behind that question that, I could get to if you gave me time, but you forced me to choose. And so that was a big lesson for us as well.
Yeah, and the genesis of the book was really in that rally, I think. I mean, for two reasons. One, we saw the same things, which was very surprising to both of us. I mean, when we were in the rally, I was actually pretty impressed by the president's ability to move that crowd. I mean, he's quite charismatic in person when it came to being able to get his message across to his flock. Yeah. I at one point thought, and this came back to haunt me, but I at one point thought, hey, we could be at a Obama rally in 2008 when Ben Carson was on stage talking about unity and love and the forces that divide us and overcoming them. And then outside, we saw the same thing with the protesters. I mean, we were inspired by some, and others seemed to be there just to break things. And every single time we talked about any of this stuff, we were like, yeah, that's what I saw.
I've never seen the president in person, but I did nevertheless have the sort of surreal experience of following the president as a speaker at CPAC. I wasn't physically at the last CPAC event, but I was speaking on a panel broadcast out of Pepperdine that was basically funneled in immediately after the president's speech was done. And so we had a live audience at Pepperdine, and I'm sitting in front of this big screen, and Trump was scheduled for 30 minutes, and he took like an hour and 45 minutes and so forth. So me and a couple of panelists
that's a Trump half hour,
right? Exactly, right. That's a Trump half hour. So me and a couple of panelists are just kind of waiting in the on deck circle to go on, and I sort of got this feeling because he's given one of his real kind of stem winders,
Yeah.
And hey, look, he wouldn't be Donald Trump if he wasn't funny and charismatic, in a way that really works with a lot of folks. And I remember thinking like, man, I got to follow that. That's that's quite a tall order. But the reason I mention it is just because we had a live audience at Pepperdine too, and folks had their MAGA hats on and so forth. And I think that the thing a lot of people miss about Donald Trump and Trump's connection with the folks who love him and support him and so forth is that Trump really does. I mean, you can say he's inauthentic or insincere if you want to, what have you. But Trump really does connect on a visceral level with folks who feel like they have not been heard. At least some folks in America, folks who voted for Mitt Romney or John McCain, but who felt like establishment Republican leaders never really understood them and their concerns and where they were coming from in America. That they were just sort of political fodder for the ambitions of the financial and the corporate elite in the Republican Party. And Donald Trump came along and actually said, no, I love you and I'm fighting for you because we are much the same. Trump uses the word love more than just about any other president or politician I've ever heard.
Yeah, that was surprising.
Interesting
at the rally,
enough, right?
Yeah.
And because, so much of the rest of America equates Trump with basically being an avatar of hate and fear and prejudice and so on and so forth. But you really do feel the love between President Trump and the folks who support him, because they feel like there's a real genuine personal connection there. And whether you feel that towards the president or not, it is an important dynamic, I think, to understand if you want to engage with folks who are supporting a president who you yourself might not, if you're one who doesn't. So anyway, just a little observation. But I'm curious to know about maybe some enduring friendships that might have been made over the course of these experiences, because I imagine there must be a few people who maybe you still keep in touch with, or who have at least left lasting impressions. Care to share some highlights?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. The other genesis coming out of that rally was that we said, okay, we saw the same things, but then, and we saw this opening of dialogue, but then it all broke when the explosions went off. And in that moment, we decided politics aren't going to be our answer. We need to go away from politics. And from then on, our road trips are really sort of seeking those relationships, those friendships, those people that are outside of these spotlights that we think that we found so distortionary. And from there, do you want to tell the Paige story? Should we talk about Paige?
Yeah. So the very next day, we were heading north away from Phoenix. We stop at Horseshoe Bend, and right across the street is a shooting range. And we were still tense from the rally. I love shooting, so I tell Chris we're going, and kind of forced him inside. And we had a good time at the range. All the guys who worked there were veterans, and two of them happened to be Marines. We served in similar units. We knew people in common. And that night, they invited us back for a barbecue. One of their nephews was enlisting into the Army, so we go back that evening and spend a whole night with them, and really bonded. And going into it, I was a little nervous. There was some feeling I had about bringing Chris, someone who looks like Chris, into my old world of the military. And I didn't know how they would respond to Chris or how Chris would respond to them. And it turned out that Chris actually bonded pretty deeply with the guy Nishan who runs the gun range. And we've stayed in touch with him since. And it was that first evening where they were all Trump supporters. They actually thought Chris and I were a couple.
It's probably happened to me and you, John. Honestly.
Oh boy.
And they didn't care. They didn't care at all. And they welcomed us in, treated us like family, and brought us into this intimate, moment where one of the nephews was joining the military. And I think that really changed our perspectives and set us on this path to find all these great deep relationships. And that's the heart of the book is these people we met and the lessons they taught us about what it means to still be Americans together.
And that's the thing too. I mean, when we got out of the rally circumstances where there was this sort of expectation that you're on one side or you're on the other, even though that's not what we found, it's so much easier to get along with people. I mean, I had nothing in common with Nishan, absolutely nothing. And yet we're able to talk as two human beings because we're in this strange situation where we just kind of stumbled into this enlistment, and there's just no script. There's no script. And humans naturally want to get along. So we start, especially in a circumstance like that, where you're enlisting you're doing something important for family, and you're breaking bread, quite literally, and then you say, okay, where are you from? What's your family like?
And I think it's a great point about the spotlight and the battle lines, because I think that's true online as well.
Yes,
it's almost like you're in battle when you're online, and so many people live in like-minded communities, so their only real exposure to people who are, on the quote-unquote other side is from online. And I think that goes both ways. So it's like, how do you find ways to actually bring people together? Like, the exposure is the first part, and I think that's increasingly difficult with all the geographical sorting that's going on and all the tribalism. Because you mentioned Trump talking so much about love, which I think is true, but I also think there's a point to be made about the connection that he's promising is often predicated on opposition to another group.
Yeah.
And you see that on the left, too. How do you think about that, John?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that one of the ways in which we kind of build communities, really tribal allegiances, is by kind of defining our community and our tribe in opposition to the other one. And so it is, and this is not just a particular criticism of Trump, it's very much the nature of politics, broadly speaking, on the most crass and cynical level, to strengthen the bonds that exist between our side by pointing out all the ways in which the other side is a threat. And I think that the project that we're engaged in with Better Angels, and really what you guys are doing, is a means of sort of digging beneath the more sort of, the real but more surface level sorts of cultural and philosophical disagreements that exist between us, to sort of point out the fact that there are values and interests and really just sort of a shared kind of landscape maybe of heritage and shared kind of just this wealth that is the United States of America and its geography and everything else that's rich about it, that we share, that goes beyond these differences. And so you guys managed to prove that, both in terms of your friendship and in your ability to, each of you, sort of go and break bread with folks who are obviously entirely different in so many ways. And yet there is a bond there that can be revived, but you've got to actually breathe some life into it to do it, right?
That's right. And I mean, you guys are doing that. And that's what I think is so amazing about Better Angels. The thing we found is those differences are real. Like we do have different priorities, different values, and the tribes do thrive on emphasizing those differences. But we also found that people on the individual level are very complex, and in seeing that, it allows you to have a little bit of humility about what they might believe. So the other person we became very close with was this guy Pete Milan, and Pete was a long haul trucker. This was our first road trip after Phoenix and meeting Nishan and the guys at the shooting range, and we decided to try to spend a week with a long haul trucker, and Pete ended up taking us in. And the first time we met him, he shows up in a "Make America Great" t-shirt, and immediately we're like, oh God, we're in for
so much for getting away from politics.
In for a ride,
yeah,
figuratively and literally.
Yeah,
exactly.
5 days in a cab.
And then as we spent more and more time with him, we found his views were very nuanced and complex. And, he started off our first political conversation saying, the one thing that drives me crazy about Donald Trump is he doesn't admit climate change, which is not what you'd expect from a long haul trucker in a "Make America Great" shirt.
Yeah. And then he shifted into the third in his diesel rig.
But we ended up finding that this guy who teared up every time he talked about his lesbian sister was really a deep person. And anything you would have preconceived or judged about him based on the one thing we knew, which was his red t-shirt, would have been wrong. And that was a good lesson to us that, party symbols, flags, tribes, they don't fully define the members, and you have to be humble about people to get beneath that and actually open up to the possibility that they have a lived experience that is informing their views, that if you just ask the questions, they'll tell you.
Now, one thing that really, a lot of people would argue, I think, that beneath the right-left divide in America, the thing that makes it so intractable in our current moment is the fact that that's not entirely, but to a certain significant degree, sort of a stand-in for a racial divide that sort of runs as a subtext beneath a lot of our political divides. And even though it's not a strict black and white divide necessarily, but there is a divide in terms of how it is we interpret kind of the social reality of the United States on the basis of where you're coming from ethnically and so forth. Do differences in privilege determine differences in outcomes for groups, or is that just kind of a narrative meant to serve the political interests of activists on the left, maybe, what have you? So some folks might look at the two of you and say, well, look, one may be Republican, one may be a Democrat, but you're both white men, right? Both straight white males and so forth. So maybe that makes it easier for you guys to go have this cross-country excursion, so on and so forth. Did you guys find that you had any interesting or challenging experiences with people in engaging sort of racial narratives? And if so, what did that wind up looking like?
Yeah. So, I think one of the most enduring fights that Chris and I had was this question of, is America good, healthy, strong, or is it coming apart? And I think a lot of that fight was kind of underpinned by the socio economic and racial problems that we see in the country. And what we found on the road I was the optimist. I said, no, America's good. We're going to find evidence of it everywhere.
Right.
And what you find on the road is that there really are deep problems, and they're real and powerful. And that was kind of really brought home when we went to Tulsa. And in 1921, Tulsa had a race riot where 400 African Americans were killed. And
I started watching Watchmen on HBO, which is all about that.
Exactly. And, it's a story that most people in the U.S. didn't know. And they didn't know it because people in Tulsa didn't talk about it.
Sure.
The African-American community didn't want to face any backlash. And so they kept quiet about it for decades.
Well, and they were silenced. I mean, there was
silenced.
Cross-sport effort.
And so, it was impossible for me not to recognize that there really are these deep problems, and you can't just wash over them with patriotic language about the country. But what we found, and that we think is the path forward, is that there were people on the ground in Tulsa from Black communities, white communities, Latino communities, who were all trying to make the city better, and they were recognizing the consequences of that long history. They were talking about it. And we had this one amazing pastor named Jamal who told us that, healing all begins with being able to talk about it. And so they're having conversations across the city about what happened, why this happened, and what are the consequences of it. And by bringing it out in the open, they're able to begin to heal and to move forward. And it's going to take time. And, those scars are always going to be there. But there is a path forward. And that's what we're hoping people take away from this book, that, Republicans naturally rebel when they hear language that says America's a bad country. And Democrats naturally rebel when they hear things like, no, it's all good, and all those problems were in the past and there's no scars. There is a middle ground, but there's also a way of saying, let's talk about this, let's get it out in the open, and let's figure out together how to move forward. And we saw it on the ground. We think it's possible. It's hard in the current environment. But we've it's always been a struggle. That's the kind of promise of America, that the struggle's there and ordinary people can push it forward.
And I think there's a key point there about language too. And how do you find the right language to speak to both sides? And that's something we've struggled with in terms of sort of uniting the language of patriotism with the language of empathy, and sort of hearkening back to our founding ideals and the pursuit of a more perfect union, which accepts the premise that our union is imperfect. John, do you want to say a little bit about how you've been thinking about that? Because as part of our 2020 bus tour, we're centering it thematically around American identity. What does it mean to be an American in 2020? Are there meaningful values that can unite us across ideological difference? And how are they expressed differently by the two sides, even if there are commonalities?
Well, what we're going to be doing on our tour is essentially inviting the American people into a conversation over what it means to be an American. And I mean that quite literally, because part of what we're going to be doing at every stop is holding a Better Angels debate, which will be chaired by our colleague April Lawson, who's designed the Better Angels debate program. And the way she designed it is it's meant to not so much be a competitive debate with winners and losers. The idea is that you bring your passion to advocating and defending your position, but also that you be honest about the ways in which you may be uncertain or not sure about your own particular feelings or opinions on a given subject. And so the idea is to get people talking about, well, what does it mean to be an American? And what I'll be contributing to that is sort of giving speeches at each stop on this subject, just to sort of dimension the conversation. Because I think where we're starting from with Better Angels, and certainly where how I tend to go about looking at it, at the question, is to say that you have right and left, broadly speaking. You have sort of liberal, progressive, conservative kind of dichotomy in the country. And in a very broad sense, you could say that, well, folks who lean left tend to focus on our ability to kind of perfect the country, right? To progress, right? To sort of evolve. Whereas conservatives tend to want to do justice and hold on to our foundational sorts of ideals and principles. But if there's this idea that the United States of America was born with a perhaps not realized, right, but nevertheless a stated commitment to liberty and equality, it makes sense to me to think that right and left really need each other to fill out their respective goals, because if we're going to progress as a country, we have to honor those founding values. And if we're going to honor those founding values, we have to keep leveraging them towards the future perfecting of the Union, right? And so framing a conversation that takes place within, those markers, I think, is part of how we want to kind of bring all sides into the dialogue, into the conversation, to arrive at a conception of who we are as a people that does justice to both of these broad philosophical points of view. Something that is rooted in where we come from, but that is not complacent in terms of not wishing to improve, right? And so, to me, America is an ongoing dialectic, really, between, folks like the two of you and, Karen and I, and just the whole expanse of philosophical and cultural diversity in the country. And my big concern, I think our big concern, is that the way the conversation has started to unfold in America in recent times, I think we're starting to lose that premise, and at various points we do lose the premise in American history. So this is not entirely new. But now in the age of social media, so on and so forth, there's this idea that you can utterly obliterate or annihilate or destroy the political opposition and just make them irrelevant or, invisible for the future. And that's just not the way it works. The civic project, I think, in our view, is one that is about building these relationships and building on them, as opposed to trying to eliminate certain people from the American family, as it were. So that's the framing of our mission. And to me, you guys' story kind of proves the point in a lot of ways. And so I guess I would want to sort of round off this conversation a bit by kind of looking at the ways in which maybe you guys have sort of changed over the course of this. And because, I can't imagine that you guys aren't different men now, just sitting here in front of me, different people now, 7 tours later than you were at the start of it. So I'd be curious to know, how have you guys changed, and where do you guys plan on taking this after the book comes out, right? Yeah. Do we retire, or is there another act to this ongoing saga? But
we're much more tired than we were at the beginning.
Okay.
No, I'm kidding. I mean, I think two things are important here. One is, we're still the same people when we started in some ways. I'm still, I still worked in the Obama administration. I still believe in that mission. I'm not going to vote for Trump. I'll say it here. Right? Breaking news.
Right.
And Jordan would say the same thing about where he is. We often say that common ground isn't necessarily getting to a place where we agree on everything. It's getting to a place where disagreement doesn't matter so much. That said, we are definitely much more humble human beings than when we started. I'll speak for myself. I personally thought I knew what was going on when we first started out. And I remember telling Jordan that there was no way that Trump could even win, and it was mathematical, so just down to even something as simple as that. I've learned that is my starting point now is, what can I learn?
Forgot about that electoral college thing, didn't you?
Yeah, whoops.
Oh yeah.
But on the road, I've also learned that in conversation with Jordan, I can learn so much coming to it from a perspective of, this is what I believe and this is what I know and these are the facts that I can marshal. What do you got? And let's get somewhere with that.
Right.
And I this is why we're so excited to come on this podcast with you guys, is that, you said it so well. It is like, this country is a dialectic. Like, this country is a constant, both conflict and give and take between right and left, or conservative and progressive, or conservative and liberal, however you want to put it. And like, when we're at our best, we're acknowledging that dialectic. We're acknowledging that we have the same values underneath it all, but we just need to figure out the right combination of tradition and progress, steps forward, and
right.
what should we bring with it. We're the same people, but we're also, I'd say, hopefully we're much more humble in our beliefs and what we think about this country.
Indeed.
Yeah. And just to build on that, I think one thing that kind of came out of this for me is, exactly, again, just to echo what Chris said, this is a dialectic, and that dialectic doesn't happen just in Congress, or it doesn't just happen, up in the offices of billionaires, like out across the country. It happens by ordinary Americans. And we saw that, and we saw it, how it can improve communities. And we saw how people from different views could actually talk. And then we also saw how our friendship led to this great project. And, it started as a lark. We thought there was no way that anybody would be interested. And 3 years later, maybe it'll just be our mothers who read this thing, but we think it'll have an impact on a few people. And the lesson there is that, both find a partner, someone who makes you better, someone who reveals your blind spots, someone who, you are excited to struggle with, and just do something together. And that thing can change people's lives and could contribute to the American project. It's the same as you guys. And I bet you guys never thought you would someday be speaking on a podcast, talking to tons of people, and potentially helping rebuild that American identity that is so easy to tear down on social media and takes good people to start building back up. And so the lesson to me is, do things with friends, like really strive to become better friends and partners, because it does make you better. It does show you sides of yourself that might have been underdeveloped. And then just try something, like try to make the country better. Anyone can do it. That dialectic is kind of all of our responsibility.
Totally. And I think it doesn't necessarily have to be something political. I guess you guys wrote in your book, I think, about the power of music in particular to bring people together. And that's something that's important to me and John. We always at Better Angels try to incorporate musical performances as much as possible. So at our most recent convention, we did a concert. We have volunteers, some of whom are on the side, are incredible musicians. John comes from a jazz background. I used to like to do some rap back in the day. So we came together and did a song from Hamilton. It was apropos.
Wow.
I guess I'd just be curious. I know you talked a little bit about New Orleans. How did music play into the trip?
Yeah, so after the Trump rally, we looked for these stories or these people get away from politics, basically, is what we're trying to do.
Right, exactly.
And pretty quickly, whether we were with like Pete in his truck and like listening to 70s classic rock, or in an Uber in Tijuana listening to the hardest death metal I've ever heard in my entire life, just music and culture and art and performance. It's this place that you don't have to be one thing or another. There's no line drawing there. We write that there, or actually we were told by a source, there's no right way to hear a tune. You just need to bring your all to it. And so we found ourselves gravitating towards culture as a means of getting along, as a means of understanding one another. And New Orleans became a very important place for us on these trips. We've been there 4 times now. We returned with very intentionally to sort of embed with the gigging jazz culture in the Quarter. Spent some time with some guys down there right before Jazz Fest, and that really is where we land. Is like you're not going to find the ways to get along necessarily in politics. You got to step outside of it. You got to find other means of understanding and articulating yourself. And culture has really been, where we found that.
Well, I was raised in my family to think of music as a universal language for precisely the sorts of reasons you're expressing, Chris. But I think that love ultimately is as well. And, the way that Martin Luther King Jr. described love in the context of love as a social value is agape love, this idea of love as goodwill, basically, intending the best, even for your enemy, right? And I think that it's the simplest thing that we oftentimes forget, because it does take discipline, moral, discipline to do. But to bring sort of evident goodwill to each of our interactions with each other, particularly those with folks who we know are going to see things very differently than we do. That is, I think, the most disarming starting point you can bring to a conversation, both in terms of its ability to bring out the best in the other person, but also in terms of its ability to allow you to bring out the best in yourself and to not be wounded by the fact that somebody may disagree and even disagree with you with some hostility. Because ultimately, the idea isn't to win an argument. The idea is to bring out the best in each other. And it's a long game, but it's a game that you play to win, right? And so on that note, I'm curious to know where do you guys go from here? Any plans for the future following the following the release of the book, or might y'all just hit the open road again and see where things go?
Definitely do that.
Well, a little of both. So once the book comes out, we're pretty excited to get back on the road. And,
That's right.
Apparently book tours are dead. That's what we've been hearing. But, we just love being on the road. And so once it comes out, we plan on driving back across the country, going to all the cities that meant something to us, and going back and seeing the people we cared about who made an impact on us. And so we'll be back on the road starting in May, traveling around and trying to have more of these conversations. Ideally, we'd love to spend some time with you guys in the Better Angels tour.
Absolutely.
Well, one thing I was going to say was that part of your third act, I don't know all the details, but part of it is definitely going to be getting to hang out with some of our folks a little bit.
That'd be great. Yeah,
because you guys are leaders in a movement. Y'all probably didn't even know it, but this American phenomenon whereby we grow together and we transcend the things that divided us. I mean, that is what makes America great. I think it is right at the heart of it. It's the great challenge of human history to be able to do that. And but you guys are doing it, and you guys are showing what this country is all about. And that's what Better Angels is all about. So.
Yeah, well, it's great to have fellow travelers in this. And, everywhere we went across the country, we had people whisper to us, like, hey, have you guys heard this group called Better Angels?
Yeah.
So, it's
right.
Y'all are out there.
You guys are definitely out there. And, we're excited to learn from you guys and get more involved.
Totally. And we're at Better Angels going to be getting on the road ourselves for our 2020 bus tour, the itinerary of which is still being hammered out. But we know we'll have a West Coast leg. We'll definitely do a big event in LA. We'll be going through Ohio, Iowa, probably hit the nation's capital, culminating at the 3rd annual Better Angels convention in late May in Charlotte, North Carolina. So I'm sure we will find a way to cross our travels at some point. Before we let you guys go, just tell our listeners, when is the book coming out and how can people get it?
Yeah, so the book comes out May 5th. The title is Union, a Democrat, a Republican, and a Search for Common Ground. Yeah. And it's available for pre-order on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And we'd appreciate any
get your copy.
Yeah.
There we go. I can't wait to read it. Kieran, why don't you sign us off? Let folks know how they can support the podcast.
Yeah, please, if you enjoyed this podcast, if you want to hear more from Jordan and Chris, if you want to tell us what we did right, what we did wrong, any questions, any suggestions for future guests, shoot us an email at media@better-angels.org. And if you liked what you heard, please review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you're listening, and we will catch you next week.
Better Angels 2020, building a house united. Till next time, folks.
Happy Thanksgiving. Peace.